When a blizzard comes, it does more than bury roads and knock out power. It narrows the world until nothing remains but frozen wind, white between you and everyone else, and the choices you make in that small, impossible space. It strips away layers of safety you take for granted. The neighbor's porch light, the distant hum of a highway, the simple fact that someone else is awake, and leaves you exposed in ways you could never imagine. Content warning. This episode contains descriptions of assault, violence, and other unsettling themes. If those topics are triggering for you, please take care as you listen. These are 3 reported first-person accounts from different corners of North America. People who thought a storm would be an inconvenience and found something darker instead. Each story stands on its own. A house in rural South Dakota, a farmhouse in upstate New York, and a backcountry ridge in British Columbia. Each begins with a whiteout and a decision. Each ends with a blank space where answers should be. I won't pretend there's a single explanation for all of it. What I can promise is this. By the time the wind dies, you'll be left with the same uneasy question they were left with. What did the storm really hide? Story 1. The Neighbor, South Dakota. I moved out here because I wanted quiet. The house sat where the blacktop pinched into gravel, and then simply ran out, replaced by fields and the occasional ribbon of fence posts. Winters were the reason I chose the place. The open sky, the way you could see storm systems roll for miles, the kind of cold that cleaned away the noise of a city. For the first few years, it was exactly what I'd hoped. Long stretches of solitude, punctuated by neighborly waves at the mailbox, the occasional borrowed cup of sugar left on a porch. That February night, the storm rolled in faster than the weather service had said it would. The sky whooshed, not the polite, distant wetness of a forecast, but something raw, as if the wind had teeth. I remember the truck failing me first. Frozen brake lines, the engine coughing and refusing to catch. I sat for a long time with the heater sputtering, breath fogging the windows, and watched the world outside become nothing but a moving wall of white. My phone showed a weak signal. Then nothing. The highway was gone in the blink of an hour. By the time I started walking, the road was useless, a driftscape with occasional hints of pavement. I had the jacket, the boots, the headlamp, but cold found ways into the smallest gaps, under the collar, through the seam at the thumb. My hands went numb fast. The house I'd moved from, my house, felt both dangerously close and impossibly distant. My plan was simple. Make it to the nearest neighbor's place, warm up, call for a tow when the storm eased. Joe's place was about a quarter mile, a squat farmhouse with a sagging porch and a kerosene lamp that always seemed to be burning no matter the hour. In daylight, his property would be obvious. Farm equipment half buried behind a low bank, a doghouse by the lean-to. At night and under a whiteout, it was a shape until I knocked and light spilled out. I remember the sound of my knuckles against that wood, muffled, animal in the wind. When the door opened, the warmth hit like a hand. Joe was broad, older than I'd expected, the sort of man who looked as if he'd never wasted anything, including his words. He let me in without much ceremony. "Cold night," he said, like it was an ordinary observation. His house smelled of wood smoke and stew, and there was a single lamp on a table, the rest of the room wrapped in shadow. He offered coffee. He moved slowly, but the movement had a kind of attentiveness that suggested long hours at a bench or behind a steering wheel. He asked where I was headed, and I told him. There was something off the moment I sat down. Not something I could name clearly, a flicker in his eyes, a too long pause over a syllable, the way he looked past me at the wall, the way a man looks at a photograph of someone who should be there, but isn't. He began talking in small, meandering ways about the weather, about how the storms had gotten worse in recent years, about how lonely the winter could be. He said the name of a woman once, as if rehearsing it. Mary. And then he shrugged. He said the name and then changed the subject, and the sound of it hung in the room like an absence. At some point, I went to get my things from where I'd left them in the entry. There was a narrow hallway that led to a bedroom, and the house felt like it had been flattened by time. Photos small and faded on the mantel, a clock that had stopped at 2:14. I remember how clean one side of the table was, an entire place set as if expecting another person that night. Joe's hands were steady as he poured coffee, but when he turned, a shadow shifted across something in his face. I told myself I was being paranoid. The wind had a way of making people seem sharper, angrier, softer than they were. Maybe the isolation had played a trick on me. Maybe there was a charitable explanation for everything. I wanted to believe that. The house was single-story, or I thought it was. So when I heard the noise above, an unmistakable shuffling, the soft scuff of feet where there shouldn't be feet at all, I froze. "There's someone up there," I said, because saying it aloud made it less like a hallucination. Joe looked at me for a long moment and then he laughed. Too small, not really a laugh. He told me there wasn't an upstairs. His face for the first time stopped being anything close to friendly. He stepped toward me faster than I'd expect a man his size to move. The room shrank into that moment, lamplight, steam from the coffee blurring like a watercolor. He reached for me. It was sudden, a hand at my jacket, another on my throat, a weight forcing me back against the chair. I tasted metal, fear, and then the sharp, sterile tang of my own mouth. I don't remember every second of the attack. Memory is cheap in those moments. It fragments into images. His breath close enough to fog my cheek, the sound of a chair scraping across the floor, the thump I felt when I fell. He was muttering, low and steady, about her and not leaving and why would she go. The words clotted together like snow in a glove. I remember thinking, irrationally in the flash of it, that his voice had the cadence of someone rehearsing a confession and trying not to hear it himself. Panic then, and the animal focus that panic brings. I kicked, I shoved, I grabbed at his wrists. My fingers found a mug, ceramic, thick, and I slammed it into his hand. It wasn't heroic, it was necessary. He staggered, and that tiny opening was everything. I ran, not measured steps, but the kind of running you do when the world narrows to a single exit. Outside, the storm seemed to rage with particular hunger. The porch steps were a sheet of ice. My hands were useless by then, numb beyond pain. I slipped, cursing, grabbed at the railing. The yard stretched into a whiteness where every shape flattened into possibility. Was that a fence? A drift? I ran toward the glow of another house, toward the sound of a television muffled through walls, toward the porch light of Kathy and Brandon. They took me in without question. Warmth, chatter that was too loud and reassuringly mundane. Someone talking about a dog, about the price of feed, about nothing that mattered to the moment. Their living room smelled of lemon cleaner and wet wool. They pressed blankets into my hands and made me sit by the fire. Kathy's eyes went soft and then hard the moment I began to tell it. Brandon stayed quiet, his jaw working. They listened as I told them what had happened, and when I laughed in that thin, fractured way people laugh to keep from collapsing, Kathy simply hugged me and said, "You did the right thing coming here." We called the sheriff from their landline. The signal through my phone was still a ghost. The deputy arrived with snow scraping from his boots and the measured, professional calm of someone trained to separate fact from story. He walked through Joe's house in that precise way, taking in the stopped clock, the set place at the table, the single lamp. He asked me to recount what had happened. I told him, and in the telling things rearranged themselves. The order of words, the exactness of the shove, the ones I couldn't remember clearly. He took notes, careful, and told me he'd pass them along. He said, "We'll check records," and, "We're short-handed tonight, but we'll follow up." Those are phrases I remember like cold coin. Afterward, as dawn smeared gray over the fields, people in town began to talk. The story spread in stuttering versions, embroidered as small-town tales do. "Joe's wife," some said, lowering their voices, "disappeared years ago. Never found." Others shrugged, saying the county had looked and found nothing conclusive, that folks made up reasons to explain what they couldn't stand. I kept my reporting consistent. I had been attacked, I'd escaped, I'd been sheltered. What people did with the gaps was not my business, and yet it became my burden. There were whispers that went beyond the immediate. People began to look at Joe in ways they didn't look at him before. More sideways in the grocery store, quieter than polite in the hardware aisle. Neighbors said he kept odd hours, that he talked to himself, that the kerosene lamp was always burning through the night. None of that is proof of anything. The sheriff's office closed the case as no evidence for further action, on the log that I later obtained, a phrase that felt both procedural and punishing. Legally, there was nothing to hold on to. I still drive past his driveway sometimes, though not often. The sight of that sagging porch makes something like cold pool into my gut. I sleep with the curtains shut. I take different routes to the store. Kathy and Brandon are friends in a way that also carries the memory of that night. Their hands on my shoulders, their insistence that I stay with them at the time, the meals they brought over for weeks afterward. There is gratitude, always, tangled with an unease that doesn't let go. What haunts me most about that night isn't merely that a man I had trusted to be neighborly tried to choke me. It's the way the storm seemed to act, not only as a backdrop, but as an accomplice. How wind and whiteness erase the ordinary markers that make a place safe. The road that had guided me to his door became a blur. The house that should have protected me nearly destroyed me. And afterward, when facts were thin and rumor thickened, the community's need for a tidy explanation collided with official caution. People suspected. The sheriff's log said otherwise. I don't pretend to know what happened to Joe's wife. I don't say he did it. I only know how the night felt, the way voices turned small inside a house already full of absence, the concrete terror of fingers closing on my throat, and the cold, surprising relief of Kathy's embrace a few hours later. Memory keeps the edges sharp by necessity. It refuses to let the rawness settle into a neat narrative. There are things I can't recall in order. There are moments that return as images, a cup of coffee tipped, the lamp's light on his knuckles, the sound of shoes scuffing where there should have been no steps at all. When people ask whether I moved away, I say no. Part of me is stubborn, a small pride in staying put in a place that had been mine by choice. Part of me is also tied to the months of quiet before that night. Summer harvests, neighbors who fixed a fence without asking, the smell of cut hay and diesel oil. Leaving felt like letting the storm win in a different way. So I stayed, and I learned new habits. I bolt doors earlier, I sleep with a chair wedged under the doorknob sometimes. I keep a bag packed in the closet with extra gloves and a spare phone battery. These are small rituals of safety and superstition that do their work whether or not they change anything. There are nights when I still think I hear footsteps in rooms where there are none. And there are the nights when a porch light glares in the wind and every shadow is a possible danger. The worst ones are the quiet ones, when the storm is a distant rumor and the world seems predictable and safe. It is then the memory waves up, an image of the porch, Joe's hand, the startled relief of Kathy's grip, and the past intrudes with a clarity that makes the present feel precarious. If there's any comfort, it's this, that on the worst night I ran toward other people. Kathy and Brandon didn't let me freeze alone. They were living proof that even in the whiteout, there are those who answer the door, who offer blankets and soup and a place on the couch. The memory of their house is a small, stubborn warmth I carry when the rest of it grows thin. If this is the place where you expected to hear me finish the first account, to tie a neat bow around it and move on, know that the story doesn't end with me sitting by someone else's fire. There are other things that happened that night. Things that didn't fit neatly into police reports or neighborly gossip, the ways a community responds, the things left unsaid, the rumors that harden into accepted truths or dissolve into suspicion. These are part of the aftermath, and they don't cleanly resolve. If you're still with me, and this kind of story is the kind that grips you, consider subscribing and telling us in the comments if you've ever felt watched during a storm. There's a small community here that shares the same shiver, and hearing someone else's account can make the isolation less total. The wind that night did two things. It kept us confined, and it erased the footprints that might have told a fuller story. That erasure is one of the themes that runs through what people in rural places call winter thinking. How quickly a trail can vanish, how thoroughly weather can wipe a slate clean. In the days after the attack, it wasn't just my footprints that were missing. It was evidence of a life that might have explained a person's choices. Where there might have been a paper trail, a record, an answer, there was instead an absence heavy as a lid. Locals talk about those absences in low voices over coffee at the diner. They compare notes about nights they saw the kerosene lamps burning long after everyone else had gone to bed, about trucks that never started in the morning, and old dog houses that sit empty. They swap theories the way some people swap recipes. Mostly these conversations soften into a resigned shrug. Winters are dangerous, and people do dangerous things in dangerous times. But there's a difference between danger and predation, between a storm that simply makes survival difficult and one that provides cover for something deliberate. That's the question that sat in the back of my mind for months afterward. Was the blizzard simply an environment, or did it let something else happen that would not have been possible in the clear light of day? I began to look at the map of the county differently. I learned to read the lines of driveways and the patterns of houses clustered in improbable knots, where people had decided long ago to make neighborly bonds despite the cold. I read sheriff's reports as if they were riddles, the same way one might study weather charts for signs of an approaching front. There were no dramatic updates, no arrests, no bodies turned up in any salvageable way, no confessions transcribed in neat paragraphs. The mystery persisted the way a toothache persists, a steady, dull throb behind the sense of normal life. At night, I would find myself replaying small decisions in the raw and ridiculous light of hindsight. Why did I walk to Joe's instead of waiting in the truck? Why did I accept the coffee? The mind is cruel in these ways, sifting through the options like someone tracing a cracked mirror for the exact spot where the fracture began. You find yourself rearranging what-ifs, practicing choices you might make if the scenario ever recurs. It's a futile practice in some ways, because storms don't play by rehearsal. They are their own actors, and the set has no repeatable takes. Sometimes after a storm, towns will convene at the feed store, and the talk turns to safety. Generators, cell boosters, chains for tires. In those earnest, practical conversations, the other layer, predation, disappearance, rarely finds its place. People prefer to fixable problems. Buy a bigger snowblower, hire a plow. It's easier to measure horsepower than motive. Still, at the edges of those meetings, there are faces that say in 5 words what can't be said aloud. We don't know what he did. They add softly, alleged, as if that last word can make any difference in the way the rest of a life is lived. That winter, when the roads thawed and the trees showed scars of the storm's violence, I went back through the sheriff's log. There it was, a terse entry noting a disturbance, a complaint, a follow-up. No classifiable crime. The paperwork offered the illusion of closure that everyone pretends to respect. In quiet hours, though, the illusion is brittle. There are nights when I still drive by Joe's Lane and look at that porch and see for a second the shape of a person in the window. My stomach tightens, my hands on the wheel go cold. Then I catch myself and remind myself of what facts there are, what rumors are, what might be true and what might be projection. It helps to name the doubt, to bracket it. It doesn't dissolve the image, but it keeps it from swallowing the day. In time, I told the story publicly, in a local meeting and later on a neighborhood forum. The reactions were predictable: sympathy, skepticism, code switching to practical safety tips. A few people wrote privately to say they'd had similar scares, small things that hinted at something off kilter. Others wrote to say I should have pressed harder with law enforcement, that I should have insisted on an investigation. Those words carry heat. They are easy to offer from a keyboard, harder to act on when the pressure of a windstorm is closing in. I began to keep a small notebook by my bed, the silly kind with a cheap pen, where I recorded names and impressions of the people who'd shown up for me that night. Kathy and Brandon's names are written in thick, dark letters. The next page is less legible. Joe. A single word, circled twice, like a question. Sometimes what haunts you isn't the precise detail of a confrontation, but the way people you thought you knew reveal capacities you didn't expect. It's the knowledge that kindness and menace can look frighteningly similar in certain lights. That realization, more than the physical act, is what changed the architecture of my trust. It meant that in future storms I would be kinder and more cautious at once, ready to offer help, but with an eye for the small red flags that once would have seemed irrelevant. The story might have ended there, with me safe in Kathy and Brandon's living room, wrapped in a blanket and shaken. But storms have a way of extending their influence beyond the hours they rage. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself looking at other people's porches differently, listening for footsteps that weren't there, and checking locks that had always seemed decorative. The blizzard hadn't just pushed snow into drifts, it had moved something inside me. A line had been crossed, the line between neighborly trust and the possibility of predation, and once crossed, it didn't permit an easy return. And yet, as much as all this changed me, it didn't produce hard answers. There are holes in the narrative that professionals call lack of evidence, and that everyone else calls the thing that keeps you awake. The sheriff's log and the neighbor's whispers existed side by side, neither disproving the other. My memory retained the heat of Kathy's embrace, the cold of Joe's hand on my throat, the way the lamplight fractured his features. The rest remained a pale field of possibilities. The wind keeps secrets, people say, but some of those secrets are human. Weather is indifferent, people are not. That distinction matters. Weather takes, people decide. The blizzard provided cover, but it did not decide. Humans did. I didn't know then, as the bruises faded and the days lengthened, that the storm's particular appetite would be a motif, a pattern echoed in two other accounts from other winters, other places, where the wind did the same work. Narrowing sight, flattening footprints, giving opportunities to something that wanted to move under cover. There are parallels in the small domestic details, the porch light left on, the boots that don't track snow into the house, the handprints that show up where there were none. Those similarities felt like a map, but a map with missing coordinates. So I kept a list, not just of what had happened to me, but of the oddities, the stopped clock, the warm mug, the way Joe said Mary's name and then tried to fill the silence with weather talk. I wrote down the deputy's exact phrases as best I could recall. "We will file. No signs of forced entry. Follow up as resources allow." The phrases felt official and impotent at the same time. They were a kind of institutional shrug. There are certain small private acts that people perform after something like that. You test door locks 3 times before sleeping. You wake up at every odd sound and strain to pin it down before you sink back into sleep. You get used to the idea that the world contains more potential for menace than you'd prefer. They have a way of hardening the edges of daily life. You begin carrying an extra tool or pepper spray, not as a plan for violence, but as a talisman against the sense of helplessness. It helps a little to have a ritual. The storm season that year stretched, as they always do. Snow came in rolls. The sun rose pale over a field caked white. People joked again at the feed store, and the threadbare banner of small-town resilience stitched itself back into place. Life went on. I went to work, fixed fences, mowed a lawn when the thaw allowed, and occasionally when the house was very still, I would think of 2 lamps. One on Joe's table that night, and one on Kathy and Brandon's, glowing steady like a promise. There's one last image I keep returning to. The narrow path I had made on my way to Joe's, cut between drifts with my headlamp, the only sign that anyone had been out there at all. By morning, the storm had softened every edge. The path lay smoothed, as if I had never existed. That absence was the first of many small erasures that winter would produce, evidence wiped clean where an answer might have been. Between my house and the lane that led to the highway, a stretch of field has a row of fence posts. They mark property, and they mark continuity, reasons why roads bend where they do. But the posts also cast long, lonely shadows when the sun is low, and in their shadows you can imagine all manner of things. Tracks that lead nowhere, footprints that vanish, figures that appear and disappear with the shifting light. Once you learn to see those shadows, you begin to notice them in other people's yards too. It becomes a language of absence, of blank spaces where something might have been. And so, as winter slipped toward spring, I found myself living with 2 kinds of weather. The physical kind, with its plows and power lines, and a second kind. The weather in the mind that sculpts what you expect to meet when you open your door. The second weather is harder to predict, and it is the one that would make me bristle whenever a knock came at night, whenever a headlight paused at the end of the drive, whenever the kerosene lamp at the neighbor's burned later than necessary. There are more things to say about what followed that night. The petty gossip, the ways some people closed ranks while others drifted away, the internet threads that took a factual incident and turned it into a myth. There are also things I have not yet told, small discoveries and pages from the sheriff's file that read like bureaucratic riddles. But those belong to the slow, grinding part of the story. The paperwork, the rumors, the half-answers. For now, the sharpest memory remains the physicality of the storm, and the simple, urgent lesson it taught me. In a whiteout, you are more vulnerable than you realize, and sometimes the worst threats are human. I spent the next few nights sleeping with the curtains drawn tight, the curtains themselves a foolish domestic metaphor, light kept out to keep me in. The next time a storm approached, I found my hands moving differently. I bolted the door sooner. I answered knocks with a chain. I left a lamp on. Those are the small, sensible responses people develop. They don't solve mysteries, but they make the immediate world a bit more manageable. Still, the question about what happened to Joe's wife lingered. An ache lodged behind practicalities. Locals said they remembered a missing person report years earlier, filed and then shelved. Others insisted there had never been a substantial trail. Some people speculated that she had left. The word alleged shows up often in conversation, like a protective parenthesis people place around the idea that the man next door might be capable of something monstrous. It's safer to say alleged than to name guilt outright. Language in a small town is both a shield and a tool. As my winter wound down, a friend suggested I look into old newspaper archives. There I found a faint mention, an item that a reporter had tucked in between advertisements, a disappearance, a dated note, an unresolved case that had never found traction. The piece was small and factual, the sort of thing that does not impress itself on history. But when you live the kind of night I did, even a small folded article can feel like a key. I read that piece again and again. It was scant on details, dense with the neutral tone of bureaucracy. Names, dates, a mention of no foul play immediately evident. It was not a confession, it was not even a lead, but it was something tangible to hold against the whispering rumor. The winter after that one, I told myself I'd be wiser. I would not be the person who walked to the neighbor alone in a whiteout. I kept my back windows curtained. I kept the porch light on. These measures are ordinary and ridiculous at once, reminders that trauma rewires the small habits of everyday life. And yet, there are things habits cannot guard against. The weather will do its work regardless of your precautions. Storms will still come in quick, hungry in ways far beyond the snow in the fields. They will still erase tracks and smooth out evidence and leave you standing in a quiet, wondering at what had happened behind a closed door. It's in that uneasy waiting that the story lingers. I could tell you more about the paperwork, about the way neighbors clustered into camps of belief and disbelief. I could tell you about the strange solace of community, or the way a lamp in a window can be both a comfort and a threat. But those are the slow parts, the sediment that settles around a sharp event. For now, the sharpness of that night remains the part I replay most. The knock, the coffee, the way a single gesture can flip the shape of a relationship from neighbor to unknown. There are other stories like this, told in different places with different players and with the same central cruelty of winter. It hides and widens the gap between what you expect and what is true. In the next account, the knock at the door will come again, but in a different tone from a different house in a different state. The details will change, but the thread will be the same. Isolation, approach, and the small clues that refuse to add up into a comfortable answer. The next story begins with a late shift and a stalled car at the edge of a driveway, and a sound like a horn in the dark. It will test another person's instincts in the middle of a storm and leave them with a different kind of question. Not who in town could be dangerous, but what, if anything, was attempting to get inside. Story 2. The Knock at Night, upstate New York. I worked from home. the kind of job that made my living room a makeshift office, and my life a series of deadlines that could be paused for a heavy snowfall. When the forecast first called for a blizzard, I stocked up: groceries, fuel for the generator, a couple of jugs of water. I liked being prepared. The town was used to shutting down for a day or two when the white came through. I did not expect the night to become an examination of every decision I'd ever thought insignificant. The storm moved in the way storms sometimes do in that part of the state. Patient at first, a gray smear on the windows, then faster, like someone pulling a sheet over the town. By 9, the power flickered. By midnight, it was gone. The house settled into the kind of darkness the cheap LED lights can't reach. I had the fire going in the stove, and the laptop was on a battery that would not last forever. I remember thinking how quiet everything was. Quiet in a way that made the house feel farther from the road than it actually was. Then, the horn. It was that odd, intermittent sound. Not a sustained blare, but a thin, appealing signal that seemed to come from the far end of the long driveway. I peered through the curtained window, and could make out a shape where headlights had briefly cut through the falling snow. A car had stalled, I told myself. Someone would call for help. The expectation was ordinary enough that I turned back to my screen. Shortly after, there came a knock at the door. A real knock. Paper knuckle wrap. The kind you can imagine checking the mail for but not expecting in the middle of a whiteout. My first practical move was to chain the door and open it an inch. A face filled the gap, rimed with snow, hair iced at the temples. The man's breath steamed in the crack of light. He looked smaller than I'd pictured when I saw him in the headlights. Thinner, maybe 30 or 40, but worn in the way the cold ages people. "Car won't start," he said. His voice was flat and urgent at once. "Battery's dead. Wonder if I can warm up for a bit." He gestured with mittens that looked newer than his jacket. He smelled like exhaust and wet wool. I asked the obvious questions. "Where are you headed? Are there passengers?" He said no, it was just him. I asked if he called anyone. He said he had, but the signal was spotty out here. When I glanced down at his boots, something pinned to the back of my attention. They were oddly clean. For a minute, thin, sharp, the image of snow clinging to boots held in my mind like evidence waiting to be checked. Outside the porch was a smear of white. The front walkway should have had the clear, ragged print of short, heavy steps. It did not. I remember the small, sensible voice in my head that told me to keep the chain on. I kept it. I told him I couldn't let him in past the chain, but that he could warm at the back of the house by the mudroom door. He tried to be grateful, and then something about the way he looked at the threshold made my skin tighten. He had a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, the sort you'd give a stranger to hide how nervous you are. He leaned in and asked, as if naming the obvious, if I could call 911. I did. The operator was professional, and the sort of person you imagine in calm rooms. Calm, collected, noting down my words. She asked me to stay on the line. I remember the thin sound of the snow to my left, the way the storm seemed louder when you were holding a phone up to your ear, the way silence gathered behind the voice on the line like a crowd. I told the operator where the car sat, what the man looked like. She said they had units stretched thin, that someone would check the reports and get back to me. It was the same language I'd heard before, careful, procedural, and it did not make me feel safe. Then there was the banging. It began at the back of the house, a dull, insistent thump against the kitchen door. I told the operator that someone was trying to get in. The operator asked me not to open the door, to lock whatever I could. I thumbed the deadbolt and watched the chain rattle. The knocking moved as if testing the house and then grew closer. My heart tried to pry out of my chest. When the deputy arrived 30-some minutes later, he was later than I would have liked, but the storm threads stretched dispatch thin. He took in the scene with the businesslike attention of someone who sees peculiar things, often enough to keep wondering anyway. He walked to the end of the drive and talked with a man in a parka who was wrapped in a blanket and shivering. The deputy said the man had been found near his stalled vehicle, partially buried and disoriented. That part fit the expected narrative, a stranded motorist, cold and in need. What did not fit, and what has never sat right in my head, is that the deputy told me the car at the end of the drive had its engine cold. There was no fresh exhaust, he said. There were shoe prints leading to the roadside where someone had walked off to flag down help, and tracks that led back to the vehicle. Except none of those tracks led to my porch. There was a blank between the car and my front step where footprints should be, a smooth expanse of untouched snow. Later, the deputy knelt and traced a line with gloved fingers, as if trying to find the invisible path. That next morning, after the town dug itself out and the sidewalks became trenches of slushy salt and gray, I found prints that had not been there before. On my upstairs bedroom window, on the outside, were muddy smears, handprints, small and smeared like someone had pressed a palm against the glass and then been pulled away. They were the kind of marks that should leave tracks down the wall, but the stucco below showed nothing. It was as if someone had been held directly to the glass and then lifted cleanly away, leaving only the trace of the touch. Across the lane from me, a neighbor's house had been entered during the storm. They reported nothing missing. The police logged the incident as a burglary with no theft. The way that read kept me up more than any theft would. Whatever had come to that house in the night hadn't taken silverware or electronics. It had looked for something else. Some people in the neighborhood said as much in low voices. Others refused to speculate. The police were careful. They found no sign of forced entry at the kitchen window where the owner later discovered an unlocked latch. It was a small detail that sat like a puzzle piece that didn't belong. For days afterward, I did what everyone does now after something uncanny. I looked online. I scrolled through neighborhood forums and a few local Facebook pages where people posted pictures of drifts and grumbled about plows. A handful of comments mentioned a car abandoned on the highway, a call for a tow, a man whose boots were oddly dry despite the weather. People offered rational explanations in the same breath as they suggested darker possibilities. He could have had plastic overshoes, one person wrote. Another, more cautious, wrote, "We don't know if it was a prank, someone disoriented, or something weirder. Be careful." The deputy took my statement and ran his own small series of checks. Phone logs, patrol car timelines, basic canvassing. The report was inconclusive. There was no camera footage on the side roads, no neighbors who definitively placed footprints on their porch. The deputy told me later, in a tone meant to soften, that the storm complicates investigations. Snow lays a white sheet over what detectives might otherwise follow. A boot print, a tire track, a smear of blood. "Whiteouts are killers for evidence," he said. And I believed him. But the emptiness between car and door, the clean boots, the handprints on glass, these particulars refused to fold into the neat categories of stranded motorist or lost pedestrian. I kept imagining other explanations. Maybe he had swapped boots at the roadside with someone who stayed with the car. Maybe he had been carried the last few yards by another person. Maybe the mud on the window had been placed there later by a prankster or a neighbor used to practical jokes. Rational possibilities are elastic like that. They bend to hold the discomfort of an event. But even the most reasonable theories had to account for a small, stubborn fact. Whatever touched my window left only a suggestion of itself, and then was gone. I slept poorly for a long time after that. The handprints were photographed, and then the photos were added to the police file. The deputy said he'd be in touch if anything turned up. He wasn't. Weeks stretched into a quiet that felt less like closure, and more like being left to clean a table with no end of crumbs and no knowing which spills mattered. People in town told their versions with the ease of people telling weather stories. At the diner, someone said they'd seen a figure walking toward the highway. At the post office, someone else swore they'd heard a woman's voice in the night. Someone else pointed out that sometimes dogs will scratch at windows during storms, confusing owners and leading to misinterpretation. There was no consensus, only a range of comfortable guesses. Most people in the end focused on the practical lesson. Never open the door during a storm without enough information to be safe. That was the sort of advice that made sense and took the sting out of the unknown. But the small, insistent questions remained. Why were the boots clean? Why were there handprints on my upstairs window where no one should have been? Why did a house down the lane get entered without theft? There was a pattern to these oddities that matched the first story's erasures, tracks that stopped, marks that appeared and did not match the obvious route. The storm seemed to be doing the same work, covering a line, erasing the connecting threads that would have made sense of a sequence. It was like trying to reconstruct a sentence while the letters kept blowing away. I moved my bed to the first floor for a while. I kept a flashlight at the head of the bed. I began to answer knocks with a chain and a bright light aimed at the peephole. Small adaptations, reasonable, embarrassing, necessary. And in the way people do after something unnerving, I told friends and family to be careful. I was embarrassed to say I was afraid of a knock. They were kind anyway, not mocking, offering practical tips about lights, locks, and cameras. A few months later, an elderly neighbor mentioned an oddity in passing. You remember that night? A man called into the radio station a few miles over, said he'd been driving and couldn't account for a few hours. Said he'd woken up in his car with no memory of the last stretch. They sent an ambulance to his town but never linked him to anything here. The neighbor shrugged the way people do when the puzzle is too big and not theirs to solve. That is the usual closure in small towns. Stories that connect loosely and then fade. No one was ever charged with anything in my case. No body was found in a ditch. The deputy's report, like so many official documents written in careful ink, existed, but it did not answer the underlying question that kept me awake. Were the events of that night the result of cold and confusion, or something that used the storm as a cloak to approach homes and test doors? I learned to be friendly without being trusting. I watched people's hands and feet in winter, like one watches a book for its title. If boots were clean, I kept the chain. If someone refused to move from the door, I called the police. Sometimes the deputy would come simply because I'd asked. Sometimes he would say it was a false alarm. Most of the time, nothing happened. But once you have a night where the world seems to try on a face that does not fit, you don't go back to the even rhythms of before. You move through your days with a small, practical fear that behaves like an extra layer of clothing, cumbersome, but protective. The storm taught me the same lesson the first narrator learned in South Dakota. That weather is indifferent, but it can become camouflage for things that move under cover. Whether those things are human predators taking advantage or something harder to name, the result is the same. A gap where you expect a clear chain of events. After that winter, every time I heard the horn of a stalled car or a single lonely knock at the door, the old alertness returned. Even when it proved to be only a lost driver or a neighbor who misjudged the storm's reach, the memory of that clean boot and the muddy mark on the window stayed with me. Between the incidents, we all share the same small, practical changes. Extra batteries, motion-sensing lights, the knowledge of where the spare key is hidden. They are useful things. They are also humble concessions to the way storms complicate trust. You don't live forever in fear, but you do learn to make room for caution in the same sentence as kindness. The blizzard had washed away footprints once more, but in doing so, it left behind another kind of residue. The uncertainty that seeps into everyday choices. You take fewer risks. You check a knock before you answer. You call the operator and wait for someone to arrive. You sleep with a light on. All of those are small acts of preservation that add up, and they are the kind of adjustments that people make when a pattern of odd things begins to feel like more than coincidence. There are several explanations for the night I described. None are fully satisfying. None close the hole. The only thing some nights taught me was how to exist cautiously in a world where storms can be weather, cover, or both. Transition. Both stories, separated by miles, share a common grammar. The storm comes, sight narrows, footprints vanish, and the human heart is left to decipher an incomplete text. Isolation is the amplifier in both places, the engine that makes a knock louder, a porch light more prominent, the decision to accept or refuse help more consequential. The wind takes no sides, but it gives opportunities to those who will use its blankness. The question that followed each narrator was the same. If the snow erases the path, where do you anchor your trust? Story 3. The Vanishing Rescuer. British Columbia. I grew up on slopes, Racing gates as a kid taught me how to read light on snow and to trust the arc of a turn. After competing for years, I moved inland and still chased powder whenever I could. I am not reckless. At least I never thought I was, just comfortable in the cold. That winter, the forecast was gray and threatening, but I convinced myself I could handle a quick backcountry run. It was the kind of decision that felt small until it was not. The avalanche began as a sound. A soft, not quite terrible roar that one ignores in the beginning because mountains are always making weather. Then a slab loosened, and I felt a pressure like a hand pushing me sideways. I had time to register the force, more than enough time to do anything effective. Snow came over me, blanketing, heavy as a door. When the world stopped moving, I knew my leg, my ankle, was wrong. There was a hot pinprick of pain, and then a numbness that spread. Being immobilized in the backcountry is an exercise in patience and terror. I did what I could, dug a small cavity to breathe, tried to write a pack, to assess the swelling. My radio had been torn off somewhere in the tumble. The sun moved and then hid behind a cloud. I started to shout, a small thin thing that the wind tossed back. I remember not expecting help. In that area, you go out knowing you might be on your own until nightfall. Then, like a figure in a half-remembered movie, someone appeared above me on the slope, a dark shape moving with the precision of someone used to a climb. He reached me and, in a voice that seemed almost amused at the awkwardness of the situation, said, "Lean on me. I haven't used my legs in a long time." The phrase lodged in my head for reasons I couldn't name at the time. He was careful and practiced. He took my pack, checked the injury with the sort of practical detachment of someone who'd seen worse, and advised I let him support my weight while he guided me down the slope by the ridgeline, where snow was compacted and firmer. He wrapped my leg as best he could with a torn strap and pointed out the way to hop to the tree line. I remember the steady pressure of his shoulder against mine, the rhythm of his breathing, the human warmth that, in the cold, becomes as significant as water. We stopped halfway down to rest. The shelter of a stand of pines cut the wind and made a patch of silence that felt obscene in the middle of a storm. He sat back on a pack, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of my pain and his quiet words. He said something about long travels, about being out here sometimes for days. Then he repeated, as if it were a commonplace detail, "I haven't used my legs in a long time." I thought at first he meant he'd been inactive or injured in the past. His speech was clipped, like a skier's, efficient. I turned to thank him, to ask his name, and for a second, no longer than a blink, he was gone. The space beside me, where his legs had been braced in the snow, was smooth. There were no footprints leading away from the spot, no drag marks, no disturbance beyond the small, compacted, curled-out area where we'd rested. For a moment I thought he'd slid down to check the path or had moved to test a route. But when I looked, he was simply not there. Panic has a different flavor in the mountains. It mingles with altitude and cold into something that leaves a person very still. I sat and listened for the snap of a twig, for the whisper of movement, for the crunch of bounds. The slope returned its indifferent quiet. I felt foolish and raw, like a child left at the edge of a pool. I got myself down as best I could. The walk to the lot, painful, careful, with the odd help of a stranger who never reappeared, was a sequence of small victories. I found the car, drove as best I could to the hospital, and spent the next hours in the sober, fluorescent rooms that immediately wash you into another kind of reality. Bandages, x-rays, the quiet efficiency of people who know the economics of injuries. I told the ER nurse about the skier who'd helped me. He listened with the polite attention of someone who hears many backcountry tales. The nurse asked if I'd spoken to him, if I'd gotten a name, a number. I had not. It felt at the time both unthinkable to ask and too strange to anchor. Weeks later, when the bone pain had dulled and the swelling had gone down, I found a brief notice in a regional paper. It mentioned a backcountry skier who had been missing, presumed dead, found in a ravine near a